All right, so this is section 2 of chapter 1 when we're talking about theories of human development. Let's get started. Okay, so our key learning objectives for section 2 of chapter 1 are to be able to describe and apply family systems theory, to talk about the 5 systems of Bronfenbrenner's bioecological theory, to talk briefly about Freud's psychosexual theory and also the limitations, and then to describe Erikson's 8 stages of psychosocial development. Okay, so we'll be covering these 4 theories in this lecture: family systems, Bronfenbrenner, Freud, and Erikson. And then we've got some 4 theories coming up in future lectures: attachment, Piaget, Vygotsky, and information processing. And before we get going, I want to address this question that many students have: how is HDFS different from psychology? Because we've got a lot of overlaps. And I would say it's because, in general, HDFS, much more so than psych, views human development systemically and developmentally. And I'll explain what that means. Systemically means that we look at the system that you're in. So if you went to see a psychologist for your depression, they're going to typically intervene individually in terms of your individual thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. That's where the focus is going to be if they're creating change. If you come and see a therapist who's trained in HDFS, like a marriage and family therapist, they're going to be looking at your situation systemically. So they're going to be thinking, what is it about your relationships kind of in the past or currently that could be contributing to your depression? In addition, although some psychologists are developmental, they're called developmental psychologists, HDFS has a stronger tradition or a more consistent tradition of being developmental, meaning that we look at your development over time. So we're not just thinking about where you are at this point in time, but where you've been and where you're headed. Okay, so in class, if you were meeting face-to-face, we'd be doing this iClicker together. But to get you started thinking about family systems theory, I want you to ask yourself, in your relationships, which role do you find yourself more in? And it could depend upon the relationship, right? In some relationships, you might be more of the pessimist, and some you might be more of the optimist, or it could mix, or it could be like, I don't relate to either of these. So begin thinking about kind of the role that you take in your relationships. So when we look at the family as a system, we can think about the bidirectional influences between family members. So we often think about like how parents cause kids' behavior, but family systems theory would point out that it's not just parents causing kids, it's also kids causing parents, right? And then if we take that further to the transactional model, it's not just kind of a one-time thing, it's repeated, right, over time. It's the kind of these cumulative effects of our ongoing interactions. So it's not just A causes B, but it's A causes B causes A causes B over time. So when I think about my family of origin growing up, my brother was considered the easy, sweet kid, and I was considered the challenging, difficult kid. And you might ask yourself, like, how did that come about? Was it something in my parents? Was it something in me? Maybe it was something in both of us, right? But once it got started, we all kept that pattern going. And so you might imagine that when my parents approached my brother about something, they thought he was going to be easy. And so they talked to him in a really nice way. And he responded kind of in a sweet way. And when my parents approached me about something, because of all of our history, they were more tense, they were more rigid, they expected a fight, and I gave them a fight, and then we perpetuated that pattern. And so how we approach each other is based on our whole history of our interactions, and we often kind of keep a pattern moving, which we'll talk more about. I think about this even with my cats. I have one cat that's really sweet and one cat that's a pisser, and I talk to them in totally different ways based on the history that I have with them. In this class, we're just going to highlight a few of the family systems concepts, and we get into family systems theory more in depth in other HDFS classes. So the first concept to highlight is wholeness. And if you've heard that phrase, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, that's this concept of wholeness. And that, so if a therapist trained systemically is going to understand that we can't really understand one person's kind of thoughts, feelings, or behaviors without kind of seeing where they exist in the whole system. We have to get a bigger picture. So in my own family of origin, you can't really understand how I was perceived unless you also kind of understand how my brother was perceived, right? And the roles that we played. And now maybe my role makes more sense because I was kind of reacting to this like really sweet kid and I was kind of filling the niche for being a more difficult, defiant kid. Or maybe I was the difficult, defiant kid and there was not that enough room for two of us. And so my brother, unconsciously decided that he was going to be sweet and easy. Another example would be if, for example, an adolescent comes into therapy for help with an eating disorder, a systemically trained therapist isn't going to think that this is a problem, the eating disorder is a problem that exists within the adolescent. They're going to think that it's a manifestation of challenges within the family system and want to explore that. A second concept is interdependence, and a mobile is the metaphor that's often used for interdependence, that every part of the system kind of reacts to one another and tries to, as we're going to see, balance each other out and affects one another. And if you change one part, one piece of the mobile, one person, for example, then everybody else is going to be affected. So for example, if you think of a heterosexual two-parent family where the mom has been earning maybe less money than the dad, but suddenly she gets a new job and she's earning more money and she's working more hours, this isn't just going to influence mom, right? Because the changes for her are going to change everything in the family. They're going to change maybe how dad feels about himself as a breadwinner or not. They're going to change kind of who's performing household labor, how much unsupervised kid time the kids have or don't, or who's supervising them. And so it's going to have ramifications throughout the system. Just a funnier example, I used to have two cats, Andy and Pippin, and Andy was very vocal and active, and Pippin was pretty much a ghost. I actually just wondered if he was kind of neurologically kind of damaged in some way. He hardly interacted with us until Andy died. And then Pippin became very engaged. And so it was interesting that even that my cats, had a system with us, essentially. Okay, and then the last concept that we're going to highlight more on the next slides is this idea of circular causality, which kind of clues us in that family systems is really focused on the interactions between family members. So kind of what's happening between them, not kind of like, as I'm saying, the problems don't exist in the person. Often they exist in the interactions. And so we're going to get more into that with this idea of cycling the problem or circular causality on these upcoming slides. Okay, here's a very common example of circular causality between a parent and a kid. And so it's around chores. Dad, you can see, wants Jen to take on more responsibility. He suggests she trims the hedges. She starts doing it. He thinks she's not doing it right. He gets frustrated, tries to give her some feedback, and then he kind of ends up taking over. She kind of angrily stomps off, and she kind of withdraws and doesn't seem to show a lot of initiative around Dad for doing chores, which just again leads Dad to think Jen needs to take on more responsibility. And so you could imagine that Dad thinks, if they were to come into therapy, Dad thinks that this is Jen's problem, right? That she's not taking enough initiative and this needs to be fixed. And Jen, even though it would be hard for her to give voice to this, perhaps thinks this is probably Dad's problem, that he's like, a domineering micromanager, perhaps, and she can't ever get anything right with him. So family systems therapists would often kind of write this out, on a whiteboard for families to see. It's called cycling the problem. And to help family members see that the problem doesn't exist in Jen or in Dad, but it's in the interactions that are kind of unconsciously maintaining this problem. It keeps going round and round, even though neither person wants it to keep going. And so then once we look at this, once we cycle a problem, we can think about cycle breakers. So for example, instead of Dad just saying, Jen, I think it's time you take on more chores. How about you trim the hedges? Dad could say, Jen, as you know, you're getting older, you get more responsibility. It's probably time to pick up a new chore. Why don't you take some time to look around and see what, I'm doing, and if there's any of the things that I do that you'd like to pick up as your new chore, right? So empowering Jen to to be more involved from the start rather than kind of top down. Or when before dad even hands over the task to Jen, he could say, here's the things that I think are important in trimming the hedge. Or he could pause if she's missing something and kind of nicely give a little bit of feedback, but also know that it's not going to be perfect and he doesn't need to totally micromanage it, right? That this will be a process over time. And of course, in cycles between parents and kids, generally we think of parents as having more power and more power to change the cycle and more responsibility to change the cycle. But Jen could also shift the cycle too, right? She could, before she gets started, ask dad, like, what's important, or if dad's getting frustrated, she could say, hey, I want to do this right. Try to stay patient with me. We'll get this figured out, right? She could kind of push back a little bit, maybe in a nice way rather than just stomping off and shutting down. So the cycle that we just looked at between dad and Jen was the classic example of an overfunctioner, underfunctioner pattern. And so in family systems theory, what we know is that when people take on kind of this kind of circular causality, they often end up in these positions where they are polarizing each other. And this is because, when we're not talking about this too much here, but in family systems theory, we have this idea of homeostasis or balance, that we're always trying to achieve balance in a system. And so if one person is overfunctioning, then another person is going to underfunction, or vice versa. And so just a little bit more on overfunction or underfunction. If you've ever been in a roommate situation, you might have found yourself in either around chores, the overfunctioning or the underfunctioning role. If you've ever done a group project, which most everybody has, you can find yourself in the overfunctioning or underfunctioning role. And I notice that whether or not I overfunction or underfunction often depends upon the group. If I'm a part of a group where I feel maybe a lot less confident, and everybody else seems to know what they're doing and they're kind of raising their hands, then I find myself kind of sitting back and even like slouching down in my chair a little bit, kind of disengaging. Whereas if I'm in a group where no one seems to know what they're doing, and somebody needs to kind of organize things, I can really find myself stepping up and taking more of a leadership role. Some other kind of polarizations that can happen from a family systems perspective. And this doesn't just have to be in families, right? This can be friends, this can be workplace situations. So the strong, weak polarization. So if you have a friend who's kind of melting down, quote unquote, or falling apart, you're probably not in that moment going to fall apart right with them, right? You're going to have this inclination to balance them out and be like, I'm here for you. I can help you get through this. Let's kind of talk it through, right? Let me support you, let me validate you, let me problem solve, right? You're going to kind of move into this kind of stronger supportive role because they seem to be kind of in a weaker role. Similarly, kind of pessimistic or optimistic. If you have a friend who's being really kind of negative about everything, you might kind of have this knee-jerk response to want to focus on the bright side or be a Pollyanna. I know I do, right? If someone's complaining a lot, I'm like, it's not that bad, right? You want to say, well, look on the bright side, right? Or similarly, if you have someone who's just so optimistic and so looking on the bright side, you just have this like urge, you just want to burst their bubble because it's just ridiculous sometimes how positive they are, right? We're kind of balancing them out. We're reacting to them. In terms of strict or permissive, this is the good cop, bad cop, right? We've got one parent who's like doing the rules and the chores, and we've got another parent who's like, gosh, you're all into the rules and the chores. Who's having fun with them? Who's playful, right? And so then you're more playful with them. And then I look at you and I think, gosh, you're just so fun. Who's doing rules and chores? And so we, over time, can get more polarized, more different than we actually are. The seeker-sought pattern is one that emerges often in early dating relationships where one person is like, I'm so into you. You're the one for me, right? They're kind of pursuing, moving forward. And the other person is feeling like overwhelmed, smothered, is kind of backing away. And my husband and I were stuck in this dynamic for about a year. When we started dating in our 20s, it took us a long time to get out of it. And how we got out of it is my husband had to just stop seeking. He had to be like, I am not doing that anymore. And then that allowed me to kind of move towards him, right? Demand withdrawal, this happens in both, for example, parent-child relationships. Parents are usually in the demand, kids are more in the withdrawal role. And it also happens in established couple relationships where one person is like, for example, bringing up the criticism and the other person is kind of defending and kind of shutting down. And then the last one is kind of emotional rational. If, for example, I notice that if in a family everybody's kind of being stoic and really rational and kind of task focused, then there's going to be one person in the family who almost becomes the emotional tuning fork of the family and kind of starts expressing the emotion, because the emotion in my mind has to go somewhere in a family system, right? So one person is going to manifest that. And similarly, if you've got one person who's being really emotional, it kind of lets everybody else off the hook, and they're going to try to kind of balance out with maybe being less emotional and maybe more rational. So hopefully this has got your brain going and kind of thinking about the roles that you play, the patterns that you're in, and you could be kind of prepared to discuss it. All right, so ask yourself, do you tend to be an overfunctioner more, an underfunctioner more? Does it change depending upon the system that you're in? In your last dating relationship or crush situation, were you more of the seeker or the sought or a mix? Okay, so if we're in class, I'll give us a chance to talk with somebody next to you about a potential conflict cycle, or you can be thinking about this on your own. So looking back at the polarizations in the example conflict cycle that I gave between Jen and Dad, what's one that you can come up with based on your life? And then once you come up with that, what would be some potential ways to shift it? And so the idea here is that we can't change another person, but we can often change how we are behaving or interacting in a cycle. And so, for example, I'm often thinking, always almost thinking in my work and personal relationships about systems and what my part is. And so sometimes I might be in situations where I feel like I'm frustrated and it's about somebody else, but then I'm also always trying to kind of see what my part is. So for example, let's say I'm leading a committee and it feels like I'm not getting much back. People aren't really engaging. And so when that has happened to me, I think, okay, maybe it's not about these other people. Maybe it's about how I'm coming across. I'm coming across as an overfunctioner. I'm coming across as rigid and not as open to ideas. And how do I need to shift that so that I create an atmosphere where people can contribute? How do I set it up in that way? So for example, one committee that I lead, I renamed it Meeting of Great Minds. That's what we call it, MGM, because I wanted to set a tone where everybody's kind of input is valued. And it's not just me telling the committee members what I think we should do. All right, so let's switch gears and talk about a related systemic theory called Bronfenbrenner's bioecological theory. Yuri Bronfenbrenner was a Russian psychologist who was a professor in the United States. And he developed this theory, and the metaphor that he used was of the Russian nesting dolls. So those wooden dolls where you've got the tiny one in the center surrounded by kind of increasingly bigger dolls. And it's this idea that we all are kind of existing within some nested systems. So let's talk these through. We first got kind of the individual, or in this case, the child. And then we've got the microsystem. And this is who the individual comes in contact with on a regular basis. And so this can be the school, the immediate family, the extended family, the neighborhood, the peers, the sports team, whatever it is, right? And what we know is that, of course, that microsystem, the school, the family, the neighborhood, that influences the kid, but the kid also influences the microsystem. So for example, if I'm born with a special need or a disability, that's going to have a lot of influence in my family and in my school system and in my medical care, right? So the direction can go both ways. These next two systems are harder to understand. So the mesosystem is the connection between elements of the microsystem. And the classic example here that's given here is of parents and teachers, right? So two different parts of the child's microsystem and how they interact, right? And we know that the more involved parents are in the school, and the more that they're connecting with teachers, the better outcomes for kids. And so that how much, how parents are relating and how well they're working together is going to have an influence on the child. Similarly, the child is going to influence how much and how well the parents and the teacher interact, right? So if I've got a kid who's really struggling, that's going to maybe be bringing parents and teachers together more and might kind of influence, the challenges that they're facing. The exosystem is more indirect environments that affect the individual. I disagree with the Arnett textbook a little bit on this. I do think that parents' work is a great example of the exosystem. I think they put that maybe in the mesosystem. But for example, my kids didn't come much to CSU, so it was very an indirect influence in their lives, but certainly my work had a lot of influence on my kids. Could be just the money that I'm earning, it could be the hours that I'm working, it could be the stress that I'm experiencing, right? So anything that's kind of happening at work is going to have maybe an indirect influence on kids. And similarly, my kids they can influence the exosystem. If we've got a bunch of parents who have kids who are out for a snow day, right, that's going to influence CSU. The macro system is easier to understand. This is just societal or cultural values, and what's happening kind of in our current society. So, one of our biggest events recently was COVID-19. And so then that had to kind of trickle down through all of the systems to affect us individually. The chrono system is the biggest one, and chrono means time. And so that can be how any of these individual systems affect us over time. So if we think about, in our macro system, we had the legalization of gay marriage in 2014, 2015. And so how has that over time affected, for example, microsystems, right? Families. And how has that affected kids? Just this idea that something that happened in our macro system over time could be kind of having this kind of trickle down effect in all of our systems. Could also be like your parents got divorced, something in your microsystem in the past. How's that still affecting you over time today? How have all the kind of mass school shootings that we've had an effect over time in terms of, our experiences in our microsystems or policies that we have in our macro systems? Okay, so test yourself on this using Bronfenbrenner. For most CSU students, in which system would be the CSU administration, like the president and the provost? And the answer that I think would be the exosystem. So as a CSU student, you're unlikely to be directly interacting with the provost or the president, yet that exosystem, the decisions that are being made at that level, have an influence on you, right? The programs that they're making decisions about, or whether or not there's a snow day, right, are kind of affecting you. All right, let's talk about Freud. I bet you've learned about him already along the way. So he's known for being the first psychotherapist, which is pretty cool. And he also is the father of psychoanalysis, which is a specific type of therapy that's still practiced today. But in terms of his theory, we're going to learn about it. This is the only class where I ever talk about Freud, but it's not really practiced or utilized in the field of human development and family studies anymore. And so first off, Freud basically said the driving forces of development were sex and aggression. And I don't think research has totally, or I know the research hasn't, validated those as the driving forces over time. Freud also suggested that there's these three psychic structures, the id, the superego, and the ego. As you could imagine, these were very hard to research and empirically test. The id is our more primitive side. The superego is our kind of higher, more higher conscience side, and the ego is how we rectify that. So you may have heard it as the id is the devil on the shoulder, the superego is the angel on the shoulder, and the ego is kind of you in the middle balancing those out. So there's one piece of chocolate cake left. My id says it's mine. My superego says I should give that to my kids, and my ego says let's split it. Freud also suggested that personality was complete by age 6, development done by adolescence. Research hasn't supported that over time. And as we'll see, Freud's stages were focused on sensation and fixation. Okay, so these are Freud's psychosexual stages of development. So the first one being infancy or oral fixation, and so sensations kind of centered around the mouth and pleasure derived from sucking or chewing or biting. And we definitely know that babies put a lot of things in their mouths and are learning a lot by what they can put in their mouth. You know, they can taste it. When they put it in their mouth, they can also smell it. Their tongue can kind of touch it, right, and get a sense of things. But that's probably not the only thing that's happening in infancy in terms of development. In toddlerhood, the anal stage was focused on kind of, potty training and specifically kind of pooping. Certainly there is this part of toddlerhood but that really doesn't encompass, all of development in toddlerhood. And, Freud didn't actually study kids. He just studied upper class Austrian women and then developed his theory. Early childhood is called the phallic stage, where sensations are centered on genitals, and this is where the famous Oedipal complex comes in, right, where a child basically desires to be romantically attached to their other sex parent and wants to kind of get rid of or push away their same-sex parent. So obviously this is kind of a heterosexist focus here. And you will hear kids say, like, when I grow up, a little boy might say, when I grow up, I'm going to marry mommy, or a little girl will say, I'm going to marry daddy. And so that can come up, but certainly that's not the only thing that's driving development in early childhood, and it's not for all kids. Middle childhood, called latency, this idea that sexual desires are repressed. I don't think research has supported that. Certainly there's times where we are kind of more actively sexual than others, but I think we are sexual beings our whole lives. I think it is accurate to say we are focused on developing competency in middle childhood on social and cognitive skills. In adolescence, the genital stage, this idea that sexual desire is now, instead of being directed to the other sex parent, it's now being directed kind of outside the family. Certainly adolescence can be a time of a focus on kind of romantic, relationships, but that's not the only thing driving development during adolescence. So Erikson followed Freud and developed his own psychosocial theory kind of somewhat in reaction to Freud. And so he focused more on the social and cultural environment, so what's kind of happening outside of the individual. And he said that development continued throughout the lifespan. It didn't end in adolescence, as Freud had suggested. He still does have a stage model. And what you're going to see is it's kind of characterized by kind of this kind of crisis that hopefully has a positive resolution. And what we're going to see is that Erikson's theory is used more by researchers for some of the stages. Okay, so these are Erikson's 8 stages of psychosocial development, and we'll be revisiting these as we move through the class. So the first one is infancy, and what Erikson said is the kind of crisis here is to either, develop a sense of trust or mistrust, and hopefully in Erikson's mind, you're developing a sense of trust with a caregiver. I wouldn't say we talk so much about trust in infancy and toddlerhood anymore. We tend to frame all this in terms of Bowlby's attachment theory, which we'll be learning more about. In toddlerhood and early childhood, you can see we've got this kind of, we want kids to be able to be active agents in their world, to have autonomy, to take initiative, and to hopefully avoid shame and guilt. The interesting thing is that this is more of a Western view. This is more of an individualistic culture, right? Where we want our kids to feel kind of powerful and autonomous and take initiative, and we don't want them to experience kind of shame and guilt. Whereas in collectivist cultures, shame and guilt are viewed more favorably because they keep you adhering to group norms, right? And following kind of the rules and not stepping out of line. So this is more of an individualistic model. In middle childhood, the focus on industry versus inferiority, and so wanting to kind of develop kind of competence in areas maybe related to academics or extracurriculars. In adolescence, it would be kind of this goal of developing an identity. Now we know that identity development is happening throughout our lives. It probably intensifies, or it does intensify during adolescence and even in emerging adulthood, which is a stage that Erikson didn't have because it hadn't been named yet. And this one I would say is still kind of, I bolded it because it is kind of holding up more in the research. It's more of a focus. And then we've got early adulthood. In our class, we're going to get to emerging adulthood before we get to young adulthood. So we added in another stage there. But Erickson says in early adulthood, the focus is on kind of developing a close connection, like a romantic relationship. We know that this can happen in earlier or later stages. Middle adulthood, according to Erickson, is about generativity versus stagnation. And generative is like being productive and kind of caring for others. Generativity is kind of continues to be a researched area. So this, again, is a way that Erickson is used more in research. And then late adulthood, this idea of ego integrity versus despair, this sense that we want to be able to look back on our lives and feel like that it was a life well lived, and not that our regrets are kind of overshadowing everything.